There is a deed inside a fireproof lockbox under my bed in a one-bedroom apartment in Nashville, Tennessee, that has had my name on it for 3 years. The property is a 4.2-acre farmhouse in Gallatin, 40 minutes north of the city, with a wraparound porch, a hay barn out back, a creek that runs along the eastern property line, and a kitchen that still smells like my father's cornbread if you walk in on a warm afternoon and close your eyes long enough. My name is Clara Deanne Whitfield. I am 34 years old. I am a licensed real estate attorney with 11 years of practice, the last 6 at a firm in downtown Nashville called Merritt and Holt. I have closed 214 property transactions in my career. I have drafted more deeds than I have written birthday cards. I know what a legal transfer of title looks like. I know what it means when your name is on one. My stepmother, Renee Whitfield, has been renting out my father's farmhouse since 3 weeks after his funeral, collecting $1,800 a month from a couple named the Prestons, depositing it into a joint account she opened with my half-brother Derek, and telling every member of my father's family that she was managing the estate. She was not managing the estate. She was spending it. I knew this for 14 months before I did anything about it. I want you to understand that part. I am telling you this story in the order it happened, not in the order that makes me look the sharpest, because the truth is, it took me 14 months to stop grieving long enough to act. Grief does that. It makes you slow when you were always fast. It makes you patient in the wrong direction. My father, James Earl Whitfield, died in March of 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer. He was 61. He had been a carpenter for 30 years, a deacon at First Baptist Gallatin for 20, and the kind of man who fixed your porch railing before you noticed it was loose. He had big, quiet hands and a voice that came up from his chest, and he smelled like cedar shavings and Old Spice, and he called me CC until the day he died. He had married Renee 11 years earlier, when I was 23 and already in law school, and too busy becoming a person to be home for holidays the way he wanted. Renee had a son, Derek, from her first marriage. Derek was 29, unemployed at the time of my father's death, and had been living in the farmhouse with Renee for 2 years, which meant he had been living in my father's house, in my father's kitchen, watching my father's television, for 2 years on my father's dime. I do not hate Derek. I want to be clear about that. Derek is a man who was handed things his entire life and never learned to want more than what was handed. That is a tragedy of a different kind. I am not here to prosecute him. I am here to tell you what happened to the farmhouse. My father called me in October, 5 months before he died. He called me on a Sunday evening when I was making pasta and grading a junior associate's contract draft on my kitchen counter. He asked me to come home the following weekend. I asked if everything was okay. He said he needed to talk to me about the property. I drove up on a Saturday morning. He met me on the porch in his denim jacket with 2 cups of coffee. He did not wait for small talk. He said, "CC, I want to change the deed." I sat down in the rocker beside him. I asked him to tell me what he meant. He said that he had been thinking about what happened to farmland when men in his position died. He had watched it happen to 2 of his cousins. He said that land had a way of going sideways if you did not get ahead of it. He said he wanted the farmhouse in my name, only my name. I asked him why not Renee. He looked at his coffee cup. He said, "Renee is a good woman in the ways that matter to her, but this land belonged to my mother, and it needs to belong to someone who knows what land means. I am a real estate attorney. I know what land means the way a surgeon knows what blood means. It is the substance of my profession. But my father was a carpenter who had built bookshelves and window frames and a front porch on the farmhouse with his own 2 hands. And when he said he needed someone who knew what land means, he was not talking about legal title. He was talking about the weight of a place. The way it holds a family like a bowl holds water. I told him I would draw up the deed transfer myself. He said he would have his own attorney review it, a man named Gerald Fitch who had done his will, just to keep it clean. I said that was the right call. We sat on the porch for another hour and a half. He told me about the creek, how it used to flood every April when he was a boy. He told me about the barn, how his father had painted it red in 1967, and the paint had lasted 18 years before it needed a second coat. He told me these things not as instructions, but as gifts, the way you hand someone a map of a country they are about to live in. I drove back to Nashville. I drafted the deed transfer the following Monday. Gerald Fitch reviewed it. My father signed it on a Wednesday in Gerald Fitch's office in Hendersonville with 2 witnesses present. The deed was recorded with the Sumner County Register of Deeds on a Thursday. He died 4 months later. I was with him. Renee was there. Derek was not, which is something I noted and then set aside because a person's final hours are not the place for accounting. The funeral was held at First Baptist Gallatin. Renee stood at the front with Derek. I sat in the second pew. There were 240 people, which tells you something about who my father was. The choir sang, "How Great Thou Art." Gerald Fitch sat 3 rows back on the right side and caught my eye once and nodded. 3 weeks later, Renee called me. She said she was thinking about renting the farmhouse. She said it was too big for her alone. She said she had a couple interested, the Prestons, who were teachers and very clean and wanted a country property with some land. She said the rent would be $1,800 a month, and she planned to use it for the upkeep. I said nothing. I was sitting at my desk at Merritt and Holt. I was looking at a dual monitor setup with 4 open documents and a cup of black coffee. I was listening to my stepmother tell me her plan for my property. I let her finish. I said, "Renee, that sounds like something you need to think through carefully." I said it in the voice I use in depositions, which is a voice that does not give anything away. She took it as agreement because she wanted to. People hear what they want from a neutral tone. I have built a career on understanding that. I did not tell her the deed was in my name, not yet. I want to explain why, because this is the question people always ask. Why didn't you just tell her? Why didn't you correct it the moment it started? Because I was grieving. Because she had buried her husband too, and I was trying to be decent. Because I told myself maybe she would figure it out. Because Gerald Fitch had a copy of the deed, and the county had a copy of the deed, and the law did not require her to know in order for it to be true. And because I had learned by then that the most powerful document in any room is the one nobody knows you're holding. So I waited. I waited 14 months. I tracked the rental income in a spreadsheet. Not my own tracking. I had set up a property record alert through the county's online system that notified me any time a filing was made against the parcel. I had access to the Preston's lease through a contact at a property management company who ran the paperwork for Renee. The lease was $1,800 a month, 12-month term, auto-renewing. The Prestons were quiet people who maintained the property well and paid on time. They were, in every measurable way, excellent tenants. They just did not know they were renting from the wrong person. I documented 14 months of deposit records. I had bank statements, because Renee had been foolish enough to list the property address in the memo line of 2 wire transfers that my half-brother Derek had sent to a vendor, which I had obtained through a subpoena process, so routine, I could do it in my sleep. $1,800 times 14 months is $25,200. I built the file the way I build every file. Column A, date, column B, amount, column C, source document, column D, notes. I had 31 pages. In month 15, Renee made a mistake. She made the kind of mistake that people make when they have been getting away with something for long enough that they forget it requires a strategy. She filed a landlord registration form with Sumner County listing herself as the property owner of record. She put her own name on a county document for a property that belonged to me. I received the alert on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in a closing. I felt my phone vibrate in my jacket pocket. I excused myself for 90 seconds. I read the alert in the hallway outside the conference room. I went back in and finished the closing. I shook hands. I walked back to my office. I closed the door. I sat down. I called Gerald Fitch. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "Gerald, she just filed a landlord registration." There was a pause. He said, "Send it to me." I sent it while we were on the phone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the dry, careful voice of a man who has been an attorney in Middle Tennessee for 40 years, "Clara, this is the one." I said, "I know." He said, "What do you want to do?" I told him. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Your daddy would have liked that." He did not laugh. Neither did I, but there was something between us on that phone call that was warm and clean and felt like the right use of a Tuesday. I am going to tell you what happened on the day it ended, but first I need to tell you about the one person who was not a villain in this story. The Prestons. Marcus and Diane Preston were fifth-grade teachers at Gallatin Elementary. They had two kids, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a vegetable garden they had started in the side yard that my father would have absolutely loved. I had driven by the property twice in 14 months, not to be seen but to see. The porch was clean. The barn had been relatched. They had put a wind chime on the south end of the porch, the kind made from old silverware, and on a windy afternoon, it made a sound like the softest argument you ever heard. They did not know any of this was coming. They had a lease. They had paid faithfully. They had done nothing wrong. I made a decision early that no part of what I was doing would land on them. 2 weeks before the day I chose, I had my firm draft a letter to the Prestons, signed by me, on Merritt and Holt letterhead. The letter informed them that there was a title discrepancy on the property they were leasing, that the matter was being resolved, that their tenancy was not in jeopardy, that their existing lease would be honored in full, and that they would receive a formal notice once the situation was resolved. I included my direct cell number. I told them to call me if they had questions. I told them I was sorry for any confusion and that it was not their fault. Marcus Preston called me the same evening. He was calm, measured, the voice of a man who has spent 20 years managing rooms full of 10-year-olds. He said, "Miss Whitfield, are we okay?" I told him yes. I told him the property had been in my family and there had been some administrative confusion about the title. I told him that would be corrected shortly and that their lease would continue uninterrupted. He said thank you. He said, "I hope whatever you're dealing with comes out right." He did not know what he was saying and he could not have known how much it meant. I told him it already had. Now, the day itself. Renee had a habit of hosting a Sunday family dinner on the last Sunday of every month at the farmhouse. She had started doing this 6 months after my father died, which I believe was her way of establishing residency in the social imagination of his extended family. She invited my father's sister, his 2 surviving cousins, the neighbors, members of the church. She cooked my father's recipes in my father's kitchen. She sat at the head of my father's table. She had never invited me. I had found out about the dinners through my father's cousin Ruthann, who was a 70-year-old woman with a phone full of photos and no sense of privacy, who had sent me a group picture from the third one with the caption, "Miss you, honey, wish you were here." I had noted the date, the guest count, and the table setting, and added the note to my file under the column labeled social. The last Sunday of the month I chose was in late April. The dogwoods were out. The sky was the kind of blue that only happens in Tennessee in April. I drove up a 65 North with Gerald Fitch in the passenger seat of my car, and a young associate from my firm named Priya in the back seat with a document binder and a laptop. Gerald was in a seersucker jacket and tie. Priya wore a navy blazer. I wore a pale gray dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings, and I drove the speed limit the entire way. We arrived at 12:47 in the afternoon. I knew dinner was at 1. I had timed it. There were 7 cars in the gravel drive. I recognized Ruthann's blue Buick. I recognized my father's cousin Harold's truck. I parked under the hickory tree at the edge of the lot, the one my father had put the tire swing on when I was 4. The swing was still there. We walked up the porch steps. The wind chime made its silverware sound. I knocked. Renee opened the door. She had an apron on. She was holding a wooden spoon. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has opened a door expecting a neighbor and found a weather system. She said, "Clara?" I said, "Renee, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is my colleague Gerald Fitch and my associate Priya. I have a few documents I need you to see." She looked at Gerald, who she had met twice and recognized. Her expression shifted into something that was trying to be gracious and not making it. She said, "This isn't really a good time. We're about to sit down." I said, "I understand, this won't take long." The screen door was still between us. She held it for a moment, then she pushed it open. The kitchen was full. Ruthann was at the counter snapping green beans. Harold was at the table with a glass of sweet tea. 2 women from the church were setting dishes out. Derek was nowhere, which would turn out to be because he was in the barn on his phone. The room smelled like fried chicken and biscuits and something sweet with cinnamon. It smelled like my father's Sundays. Everyone went quiet. Ruthann looked at me. Her face broke open like a morning window. She said, "CC." I said, "Hey, Ruthann." I walked to the kitchen table. I set my bag down. I withdrew a single folder. Inside the folder were 3 documents, each tabbed in blue. I set them on the table in a row. The first document was a certified copy of the deed. My name, the recording date, the Sumner County seal. The second document was the landlord registration Renee had filed with her own name on it, stamped with the county received date. The third document was a letter on Merritt and Holt letterhead, outlining the 14 months of rental income collected from the Prestons, the total amount, and the legal basis for its return, with a proposed payment schedule attached. I did not slam them down. I set them down the way you set down silverware at a table you own. Renee stared at the first document. She picked it up with 2 fingers like it might be hot. She read it again. The room was completely still. Ruthann had stopped snapping beans. Renee said quietly, "This can't be right." Gerald Fitch said in his 40-year voice, "It is recorded with the county and has been since the October before your husband passed, Mrs. Whitfield. The property transferred to Clara Deanne Whitfield at that time. I witnessed the signing." Renee looked at Gerald. She looked at me. Her voice changed. It went up the way voices go when what they are really expressing is panic, but the person has decided to call it anger. She said, "He didn't tell me. James did not tell me he was doing this." I said, "I know." She said, "You talked him into it. You're an attorney. You used your—" I said, "Renee," quietly, just the one word. The way Gerald uses one word. She stopped. I said, "My father made this decision in October at Gerald's office with 2 witnesses present. Gerald will tell you the same." Gerald said, "That is correct." Renee sat down. She sat in the chair at the head of the table. My father's chair. She sat in it like a person whose legs have decided to quit. Harold, my father's cousin, had been watching from his seat. He was a big, quiet man with silver hair, a retired lineman from the power company. He looked at the deed for a long moment. He looked at me. He said, "James did this." It was not a question. I said, "Yes, sir." He nodded once. He picked up his sweet tea. He drank from it. He set it back down. He looked out the window at the barn. He said, "Well," that was all he said. But in the room, in that moment, that one word settled something. Renee said, her voice ragged and thin, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to be your landlord, Renee. The Prestons have a lease that runs through September. When it ends, you and Derek are welcome to apply for tenancy on the same terms they have, $1,800 a month, a background and income check, first and last month's deposit. The property will be maintained according to the standards in any lease agreement we execute." I paused. "Or you can make other arrangements. That is up to you." She stared at me. She said, "You would do that. You would charge me rent in my own home." I said, "It is not your home, Renee. It never was. It was my father's home, and he left it to me, and I have the document that says so." The church women had gone very still. Ruthann was not pretending to snap beans anymore. She was watching me with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression I will not try to describe because some things on a human face are private. I gathered the 3 documents. I placed 2 of them back in my folder. I left the third, the payment schedule, on the table. I said, "The payment schedule has Gerald's contact information. He is available Monday through Thursday. I'd like to resolve the rental income question without going to court. That is my preference, but I am prepared for either outcome." I picked up my bag. I looked around the kitchen one more time. I looked at the window over the sink, the one my father had reglazed himself 4 years ago. I looked at the ceiling where his copper pot rack still hung, the same one he had built from pipe fittings on a Saturday when I was 11 and had handed him tools one by one like a surgical nurse. I looked at Ruthann, who was looking at me the way women look at each other when something is understood that does not need to be said. I said, "The fried chicken smells wonderful." Then I walked out. Gerald held the screen door. The wind chime rang once in the warm air. We walked down the porch steps and across the gravel and got into my car. I started the engine. I put it in reverse. I backed down the drive the way my father had taught me to back down it, slowly, watching both mirrors, not in a hurry to go anywhere. I drove the speed limit the whole way home. Renee's attorney called Gerald on Tuesday. They negotiated the repayment schedule over 3 weeks. She paid back the $25,200 in a structured agreement, 3 payments, no interest, because I was not trying to ruin her. I was trying to close the account. The Prestons renewed their lease in September. I signed it myself, in my name, as landlord of record. I reduced their rent by $150 a month because they had maintained the vegetable garden, and I felt that deserved something. Marcus Preston sent me a handwritten note that said thank you and that the tomatoes that year had been spectacular. I put the note in a frame. It is on my desk at Merritt and Holt between two case files. Renee and Derek moved to a rental in Hendersonville. She has not called me. I have not called her. That is not cruelty. That is a boundary with paperwork behind it. I drove up to the farmhouse on a Saturday in October alone. I parked under the hickory tree. I sat on the porch steps for a while. The wind chime rang. The creek was up from an early rain. The barn was solid. The dogwoods had gone red and the hickory had gone gold, and the whole property had the look of something that had been waiting for you to come back and claim it. I put my hand flat against the porch rail. The wood was smooth. My father had built this rail. He had sanded it by hand and painted it white, and it was still white 15 years later in the October afternoon. I said out loud to nobody, or maybe to him, "I've got it, Dad, I've got it." The wind came up the creek and moved through the hickory branches, and the wind chime answered it, all those silver spoons singing at once. I drove home. I updated my spreadsheet. I closed the column labeled Notes. I opened a new one and labeled it Home. What I learned from the farmhouse is this: your name on a piece of paper is not arrogance. It is not a weapon. It is a fact. Facts do not require your permission to be true. They only require your patience. If you have ever held a document that told the truth while someone else told a story, this one was for you. Drop one word in the comments, just one. And subscribe, because I tell these stories every Sunday, and this is just the beginning of mine.